So Orchid, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's so funny, like many great ideas, it just kind of happened naturally over Twitter. Ian and I are friends, and we were tweeting at Alex at how excited we were that his book was coming out. And especially in this day and age, wanted an opportunity to connect with people we didn't know before, and form some kind of book club. And so the format of this is that we will meet every Wednesday at this time and cover a chapter a week, which is great because I only read the book right before this call, the intro chapter. So, I've got a 3-year-old running around. So it's nice that we can all do this in digestible pieces and really continue the conversation. So the format today, we'll see how long this runs as our first run. So, we'll work out some kinks, but want to do just kind of a Q&A, a moderated discussion with Alex about his process, a behind the scenes look at, why he wrote this book, what things he found surprising through the process. And then, as Ian said before, we'll open it up to Q&A. It's so fun when you have the opportunity to speak to an author directly about what they wrote, especially a project like Alex's, which took, I think, what was it, over 150 interviews and over the course of 2 years, right?
Yeah, we said 130, but definitely understated it. And it's like, after ever, counting the interviews takes an hour, and then you spend another month and it's another 10, 15, 20. So I just figured better to undercount than to overcount. But yeah, it was probably in the 150 to 200 range. So it was a lot of interviews for sure.
Well, we are very excited. Congratulations on seeing your book out in the wild, even though it's in these unusual times. So we'll go ahead and kick it off. Can you talk a little bit about, let's start with the title of the book, Always Day One. Like, what does that actually mean, and why did you focus on that?
Yeah. So it's a thing that Jeff Bezos likes to say inside Amazon. So just to give a little background, we had a bunch of meetings in New York. I already took leave before we sold the book, and we had some meetings with publishers. And I just booked a flight to Seattle and decided that. So yeah, so I got to Seattle the day afterwards. I got the agreement with Penguin, so realized it was going to be a book, and then it was time to really dig into Amazon. And I went to Seattle first because I thought Amazon would be the toughest company to report on. They're pretty notoriously secretive. They don't really like the press too much. And I just figured once I nailed the Amazon part, then I might be able to go into some of the companies I was more familiar with, like Facebook and Google. So I spent a lot of those first early weeks watching a lot of YouTube, like seeing everything that Jeff Bezos said to his company and about his company to the public, which actually he's pretty reticent to speak to the public. So it was kind of a interesting process trying to dig up those videos. And there's this one, Amazon doesn't put any of its internal communication online, like none, but there's one video from an Amazon all hands that's on the internet. And that's somebody in this all hands asked Bezos, what does day two look like? And he has like a card in his hand and he goes, what does day two look like? And has this smile. And then you start to hear everybody from the company start to laugh because this is like the third rail at Amazon. You don't ask Bezos what day two looks like because he's like a guy who says always day one. And he says something like, day two is stasis followed by paralysis, followed by like slow inevitable decline, followed by death. Just pauses. And he's like, come on, everybody, soak it in. And then he goes, and that's why it's always day one. And so when I started this reporting project, I was like, oh yeah, day one must mean just work yourself into the ground. I had heard some of the stories about how everybody at Amazon works hard. And I just imagined that this was just Bezos's way of saying like, yeah, we're approaching $1 trillion in market cap. We have 600,000 people at the time, but we're not taking our foot off the gas pedal. And if you think you can take a weekend off, you're wrong. Okay, so that's not exactly what it was. The longer I spent working, reporting on what's going on inside Amazon, the more I realized that it was all about reinvention. And the idea is inside Amazon, you have to approach each day as if it's the company's first. So all legacy businesses, all flagship businesses, they don't really matter. It's all about creating the next business even if it means cannibalizing what you had before. So this whole thing has really played out inside Amazon. And the most, I think, pertinent example is that Amazon started out as a first-party marketplace. So just acquiring things from vendors and then selling them, to customers via the website. And Amazon did all that work on the first-party side. But then they opened up this third-party marketplace where you see today all these third-party sellers that are not Amazon are selling you things, and you can buy it and they'll even fulfill it. And that first and that third party really conflict with each other, because you enable the third-party marketplace, you're actually hurting the first-party marketplace. But this has just sort of been the theory inside of Amazon the entire time of its existence, is basically saying it's day one, doesn't matter what we're doing today, we're going to just build for the next iteration of what's happening. And if our current business suffers, so be it. And that's why you've seen Amazon been able to invent itself over and over again, from an online bookseller to a first-party retailer, like we discussed, to a third-party marketplace and an online fulfillment and logistics operation, to a cloud services hosting company, to a grocer, a voice computing platform, a hardware manufacturer, an Academy Award-winning movie studio. And it's this belief that, whatever got you there to this point is not going to take you to the next stage. That's helped Amazon keep reinventing itself and inventing over and over again. And that sort of set the stage for the book. And I think this is one of the main reasons why the tech giants have been so successful, is because they have very effectively reinvented themselves over and over and over again. And when they stop, they've gotten into trouble. Like, for example, Microsoft stopped, and we'll talk about that in week 5, and they just became obsessed with Windows, and then completely missed the mobile revolution because they were so obsessed with building their desktop operating system. They're like, phones won't work. And Steve Ballmer famously laughed at the iPhone, which is like one of the all-time CEO blunders in history. So that's the idea behind always day one. It's that, right now you might be happy with your current business. You might be happy with what you're doing today, but if you don't reinvent it, you're going to quickly become the past. And I'll just end with like one stat, which is that in the 1920s, like the average, this is in the intro for everyone who's read, but the average Fortune 500 company would stay there for like 70 years, which would be an eternity now. Now it's only about 15 years, and probably even less given the current time. So that's really the idea, is that the economy is moving fast. These companies know it, and they are just not going to sit there and milk their assets. They're going to build for the future, like in a state, like in a continual state, and that's helped them stay on top.
Oh, sorry, Orchid.
Go ahead, Ian.
I would say that Bezos anecdote, right? Was that obviously, like, probably that guy wasn't a plant that asked the question. I don't think they necessarily premeditated it that much, but the response that Jeff had in that anecdote, right? Is that is that something that was really thought through? Was it impromptu? Because if I recall, you said this correctly, like he ended the meeting after that. Like that was it, right?
Right. Yeah.
It was like a mic
drop
moment.
A question. So this was an opportunity for him to convey that we're not going to, like, that Amazon, they're not going to stop and say, we're done. Right. And because like if they had done it before, like if they had done it when they got their third-party marketplace up and running, or when they had gotten cloud and said, we're an okay business, then they would have missed things like, creating something like Amazon Go or voice computing, for instance. Yeah. So that's just sort of the MO there, is they realize they'll slide into irrelevance if they're not inventing over and over again.
So Alex, in your opening, so this is like the intro and just the introduction to the book, you talk about, reinvention, always day one, of course. And then you also talk about how difficult that is to do in a large company. You brought in, obviously the pretty well-known notion of innovator's dilemma. So can you kind of talk about that, of like ideas and execution, and like kind of the balance of those two that you see across various companies?
Yeah, so this is sort of like the core of it. Like once you have this always day one mentality, that mentality alone isn't going to take you to where you need to go. And so this is like the core of why I wrote the book, is because I do believe that the work that we do is really going to be separated into 2 buckets. And one is execution work, which is work that supports everything that exists currently. And the other form of it is idea work. And that's work that goes into dreaming up new things and bringing them to life. And the problem with big companies is they typically spend so much time on execution work, supporting new products. They hire how many employees to just prop up what they have already so their flagship businesses will thrive. And they spend very little time on idea work. Apple is one good example, right? And we can talk about this in the Apple Week. But I asked one Apple employee, like, what happens if you have an idea that you're going to bring to management? And she started laughing, saying they would never even consider it. Like, there's no channel to do that. That's typical for a big company. Once they get to a certain size, it's all about supporting that flagship product. I think what the tech giants that are doing well will show is that when you use technology, and that could be automation technology or machine learning or collaboration tools to minimize execution work, you can sort of start to put some of your existing businesses on a form of autopilot that will allow you to take your people and say, well, what's your next idea? Can you dream it up for us? And I think that that's really where work is going, which is going to be good for most people, right? Like if we can spend our time coming up with new ideas, we're going to be much better off than if we have to spend our time, supporting existing businesses, because ultimately what value does that add in the big picture, if you can set those businesses up themselves. So I do think we need to look at work in these two different ways. And I mean, for any leader of a company, it's how do I find time to have my people dedicate more time to idea work? And if you're an individual contributor, or if you run your own business, it's okay, well, how do I minimize the support work that I'm doing and find time to come up with new ideas?
Can I test that hypothesis for a sec?
Sure.
So what's interesting about Amazon and the whole like day one notion, right, is that people can invent something, and it is a culture of invention, right, which is a very like engineering led culture kind of mentality. And I've read a little ahead, and that is present in a bunch of the other companies that you address in there. But it also means that those kinds of companies can very quickly diversify their revenue streams and their lines of businesses. Lots of other companies don't feel like they can do that, right? Like that's a very like old school way of thinking, in that, no, we are, and obviously like the classic like econ in college argument was that, the trains are in the train business, right? Like if Amtrak thought they were in the transportation business, we're getting people from one place to another, they could be a very different company, but they stuck to trains, and that's who they are. That's who they continue to be. Amazon is clearly in lots of businesses. They're both their own business, and they're also in the business of building other businesses. And that's a very difficult thing to extract from. So are there like very tangible management lessons that are adaptable from Amazon, or is it just like kind of the unique like Silicon Valley, Pacific Northwest culture that breeds that kind of thing? Or is it like if you're not an engineer who starts a company and grows a company, you're screwed for the future?
Yeah. So first of all, we should say that if people have questions, they can put them in the chat.
Yes.
And just to touch on this one, I don't think that this is something that's, I call it the engineer's mindset in the introduction, but I don't think this is something that's engineers territory only. And I don't think it's something that's big business only. And you look at what's happening. I'll just take a step back. There's no business right now, given how fast things are moving in the economy, that can just kind of sit and do what it does and live that, get fat on its existing businesses. It's going to be so difficult. Maybe a few will get by, but by and large, companies are going to have to adapt and adjust. That's just the nature of the way things work today, even if you're a small business. And I mean, I think the COVID situation gives us like a pretty unique example where companies that never would have adapted are now being forced to do it, and learning that they can, and building the muscle that show that they can. One of my favorite examples is a stage building company in Ireland. There's not going to be a lot of stage work going on in the next few months, but now building desks for people to work at home. My friend has this company where he takes independent artists and places their artwork in offices and hotels. And obviously that business is going to have some moments over the next, couple of months. So what he's done is start commissioning independent artists to make artwork for grocery stores that tells people to, give the 6 feet berth to everybody else in the store. And now shopping in a store with those signs is going to be a much more pleasant experience than going to a store, with these sort of designed in MS Paint type of things that we see, very sterile, very unfriendly signs. So I do think, and this is one example. To me, it really feels that like all small businesses, all medium-sized businesses will get to a point in this world where they're going to have to adapt, whether that's because the dynamics on the ground are changing, or whether that's because a big business has come and tried to take their bread. It's just going to be the case. And building the muscle to adapt and reinvent is going to be something that will really, take these companies in a way that will help them survive.
Alex, can you talk a little bit more about the engineer's mindset? And because that plays a big role in the book.
Yeah. So when we first started thinking about this book, we said, okay, what's different about these CEOs, right? Well, they're all trained engineers and they don't come out of the sales function. So what about their background have they taken to their work every day inside their companies? And so I do think that it is this engineer's mindset, and you can contrast it with sales. So typically, if you're working in a sales organization, and I know because I have, if you have an idea, you bring it to your boss, and your boss brings it to their boss, and their boss brings it to their boss. And anywhere along the line that you have somebody say, no, that idea is gone. And engineers are typically, they work in organizations where ideas travel pretty fast and without many barriers. And having a mindset like an engineer will allow a company to reinvent faster, because the ideas for the next businesses won't be gone in this chain of command. They'll make their way to decision makers, and the decision makers can bring them to life. So I give three main examples of like what the engineer's mindset is. One is democratic invention, which is a belief that anybody in the engineering organization has the ability to invent something, which you don't see traditionally in organizations not run by engineers. And in Amazon, that's really front and center, where people can put ideas down on paper and get them to decision makers quickly. Inside Facebook, it's feedback. And so engineers will typically feel empowered to go to anybody in the organization. Doesn't matter if they're the CEO or, a skip level manager, which isn't usually the case in most traditional organizations. And so Facebook has built this culture of feedback where they train people to go up to anybody and basically say, here's what I think. And the third is collaboration. Engineers are really great at collaborating. Typically, they're all working on like one component of a bigger project. And if their thing fails, then they're going to be in trouble, like a power grid, for instance. So they're very good at communicating with each other and saying, hey, here's where I am and here's what's up, and making sure that like if feedback is ideas can flow up and down, collaboration is ideas can flow side to side. And so that's in that example, I think Google really excels, where they've built some of these systems inside the company to make sure that they can collaborate, and they've really become a hive mind. And that's helped them when they've built projects that require like collaboration from across the organization, such as the Google Assistant, which has Android and search and maps and Gmail and calendar and every other Google product baked into it. So I think that like when a company operates with an engineer's mindset, they make sure that these ideas can come to reality quickly, as opposed to like more of a sales mindset, which is just like, let's milk our current asset and sell the shit out of it and become rich.
I think it's kind of interesting that like a culture like Amazon rewards people with ideas, with ownership of those ideas. Mm-hmm. Unless they're not like product ideas, like unless they're, no, we need to make our warehouses safer right now, mm-hmm. right? Or, we need to do something about our packaging because it's adversely affecting the climate. How do they reconcile inside of an organization and Amazon the difference between those two things? Because they've kind of been getting raked over the coals this week, for example, for silencing, in many cases, like firing those employees. So I'm curious, like from what you've seen, how they reconcile that.
Yeah, so I think that Amazon, like none of these companies are perfect companies.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that Amazon is really dialed in from a process standpoint. Like I think all these companies, their process is something that we can emulate, but I don't know if their judgment is always the best. And I think that Amazon is really struggling on that front. Like I do think that there's something in the mind of their leaders that, they believe in this thing called customer obsession. And to them, all that means is, let's be obsessed with getting customers their products. I don't think they see the other side of it as clearly as they need to, which is customers care about the conditions that their workers are operating in. Customers care that the people that are packaging things up and sending them don't get sick or, don't end up like suffering injuries because they work too hard. And that they're taken care of, like from financial perspective. So, I think that like the process is solid. But I think, as we'll see throughout this club, like, and oftentimes the judgment can be off. And to me, this is simply just like a Bezos thing, where he does suffer from a lack of empathy in many ways. I mean, it's obvious with his personal giving, right? Richest guy on the planet, and he gives like tiny percent of his wealth away. What's he doing with all that money? You know, while people in Seattle are homeless and advocating against taxes. So if an Amazon employee has an idea, even in the warehouse, right, has an idea to make their process better, it'll be taken very seriously. But if the Amazon employees come up and say, we want better working conditions, Amazon will try to shut them down. And so that's something that Amazon's going to need to learn in order to stay successful, is to be more empathetic to the people that are working for them and to the rest of society as a whole. Because if they don't, they're just going to get into a whole lot of trouble.
Ian, do you want to unmute Rebecca? I think
Yeah.
Rebecca had a great question come in.
Sure. Here you go, Rebecca. The floor is yours.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Hi.
Rebecca, thanks for joining.
Oh, you're welcome. So I've been teaching in higher ed my entire life, and I've mostly avoided teaching online because I like that connection, the face-to-face connection with my students. But obviously, nobody is face-to-face anymore, and it's been. I have nothing that's not absolutely profane to talk or to describe the situation in education right now. And certainly I couldn't use words here to describe what we're going through
Okay.
from the back end.
FCC. So.
Yeah, right, exactly. I would add to George Carlin's words, and I find it absolutely ridiculous that teaching in New York City, nobody planned for this after Sandy. You'd think that in a place like New York City, we would at least have taken pains to have backup plans. And so the fact that we didn't, and I teach at CUNY, the fact that we didn't is shocking, or maybe more shocking than the rest of the country. But I also think that, well, if you know CUNY, you know that it's a massive bureaucracy, and it's kind of like, trying to find someone at the post office. And it kind of reminds me, when you were talking about Amazon and, well, or how businesses get bigger and bigger, it reminded me of when I was first teaching in a small liberal arts college. I could just go to the president and say, hey, what about this? And we could do it, versus CUNY, where there's like 20 different layers and no one cares, because they'll say, what about, the budget? And it seems like they're going to have to be flexible or they're going to die. And so I'm curious as to what we did that we shouldn't have done.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, so I talk about this a little bit in the conclusion, actually, but let's fast forward. Like, I do think every organization really could benefit from looking at work and saying, what's execution work and what's idea work? And how do we minimize execution work? Right. And unfortunately, in public sector, I've worked in the public sector for a bit also. And unfortunately, in the public sector, oftentimes bureaucracies form because people are scared, and they don't, they give jobs, they don't know how to alter jobs. And I just think how much more, not only efficient, but how much more effective can our educational systems be? Can our government be, if we started figuring out ways to minimize the execution work there and making room for ideas? Like, we're definitely not a society that lacks for problems in our public sector and our education sector. We have plenty of things that we could use creative people thinking about. But unfortunately, we load them up with execution work because we don't, it's a factor of fear and, potentially just like, politics prevailing over common sense. And so, if this book takes off the way I hope that it will, one of the things I'm hoping is that it's not just going to be something that small businesses and businesses competing with the tech giants are going to grab onto. To me, if this book makes its way into some of the federal agencies and they can say, okay, well, how do we even take like small automation programs and put them in place and then free up our employees to start solving some of the big problems, whether it's health or poverty, climate, we're going to be in a much better world because of it. And especially in education. I mean, none of this works without a functioning education system that teaches students how to think inventively and leaves them, puts them in the workforce with the ability to take a few risks, not burdened by student loans. So we need this stuff to start getting itself righted. Otherwise, we're going to live in a society that's not really going to work very well. So I hope that, like, it's amazing to see an academic here, someone who works in the education system. Like, it's amazing. It's like, it was the goal, it was the hope. So, we have to find ways to have this ideology like trickle in and get these systems on their feet, because we need them more than ever right now. Like, I think right now we see that the public sector is something that we're relying on in a way that we weren't before. And we need to get those organizations functioning.
I'm one of the people who gets in trouble a lot. So that I guess that might explain why I'm here.
Good. Yeah, keep making trouble. We need that. Yeah.
Alex, do you think it complicates things that this whole situation is enmeshed, in that the education system, for example, like leverages a lot of the technologies that companies like Amazon and Google deploy, and therefore get locked into their decisions and are unable to make their own in these cases?
I think that once okay, let me put it this way. I think the technology that the education system uses is the least of its problems. The fact that they're using technology is probably a good thing. But it's really, I think this will be a theme throughout this club, but the mentality is really where it starts. And we'll get to this in like the last chapter, Leader of the Future. But we have an education system now, and Rebecca can fact check me, but too often, it's one that teaches people to memorize and spit back and not take risks, get A's, right? That doesn't create, no matter what technology they're thinking of, they're using, if that's the way that people are thinking, then they're going to get into the workplace and they'll be really good at moving numbers from one Excel spreadsheet to another, but they'll struggle to invent and to break rules in order to make things that will be of value. And so I think we need to reorient the education system in a way that enables this sort of risk taking and teaches more than just memorize and spit back and just get A's. And then we're going to be in a better shape. And would it be better if Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft had a little less power over everything we do? Sure. But I would say the first thing to change in the education system is mentality. And then we can start going into the tools and the tactics they use to get the job done.
Then you're going to have to change the federal government, and you're going to have to change assessment and the way that schools get funding. I teach in higher ed, and we have to undo what people have done. So it's very dangerous the way, Common Core is not the enemy, by the way. It really isn't. But the way that assessment gets accomplished or doesn't is dreadful. And it's because people want to turn everything into numbers, and learning doesn't get accomplished that way.
Well said. All right, so let's move on. Also, there's a couple of questions that I think could be quick.
Great.
I see some people who have asked questions that don't have their video on, so I might take the liberty just to go through a couple of them. But like a lot of these companies are engineer led. Do you ever see anybody from the marketing or sales side leading a company like the ones that you talk about in the book?
Yeah, having grown up in advertising and sold ad tech, I know as well as anybody in the industry that the marketer is the person who's got the hold on the data, right? Like the sales systems will play into the marketing person's technology stack. The entire enterprise resource, plan can play into the marketing person's technology stack.
Yeah.
So they understand at the very basic level the way that technology can help minimize execution work and make room for ideas. And marketers are often some of the most creative people in the organization. So I do see a real pathway in. And just to emphasize this point one more time, but the engineer's mindset, again, is something that is a mindset. It's not a set of skills. So I don't think you need to be technical to practice it. I think a salesperson can practice it, but they have to work to break down the barriers that they're used to that would prevent ideas from moving, across organizations. Once you set up these barriers, all of a sudden you're preventing your organization from being inventive. And if anybody in any organization, whether from engineering or marketing or sales or finance, says I'm going to make a concerted effort to make sure that we have pathways for feedback, that ideas flow side to side, and that people can invent, from whatever rank they are, then they're going to be in good shape. They can lead a company. I don't think it's the territory of engineers only.
There is another question about, so from Ben, looking to just basically asking like why you didn't dig deeper into Uber and Tesla, and basically why were they omitted?
Great question. Well, Mike Isaac wrote a great book on Uber, so I feel like he did a lot of the work on that one.
You might have something to say about
It was super dramatic. It was very good too.
I did go into Uber and talk with them a little bit about it. A couple of things annoyed me about Uber. One is their employees are viewed as independent contractors by the company. And so even it's just sort of a toxic culture there in terms of getting ideas from people. And I really wanted to focus on big companies that had managed to break this innovator's dilemma and stay strong. And that's why, I did the tech giants. And I think like the shining examples there are Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, and even Apple is having a hard time right now, which we can talk about in a couple of weeks. But I thought the example of really looking into the tech giants would be most compelling. And then Tesla, Elon Musk is so interesting, right? Like he's a guy who really runs a command and control operation. So ideas come from Elon. And if you're at Tesla or if you're at SpaceX, you're on Elon's marching orders. So I don't really think that Elon fits the bill here. And maybe he'll be able to get Tesla to like a pretty good flagship product. But I wonder what's going to happen when he's going to have to adjust. If he starts listening to employee feedback and builds these channels to bring ideas, Tesla would be a much stronger company than it is today. But it's struggled a lot, and I think a big part of that is the leadership that Elon's brought to the game, which is not a popular opinion, but I think that's the case.
All right, so I know Bill's got a question here, so I'm gonna unmute Bill.
Okay, so my question was just trying to understand when your thesis applies and when it doesn't. Certainly there are a lot of companies that have tried to apply this engineer's mindset, constantly reinventing yourself, and it hasn't worked out for them. There are other companies that are working on products where they really need to have a sustained multi-year focus on a product for a couple of years. Bringing the original iPhone to market, that required many years of work behind the scenes that nobody ever saw until they were ready to release it. SpaceX is an example of another. It's a very innovative company doing amazing things, but that is all stuff that really needs to be planned with years-long lead time for a lot of the stuff they need to do. So clearly your thesis works in some cases, but can you help us understand some cases where it wouldn't apply and how to decide where it should apply? Should every employee say, company, we should go implement this? And I don't think all companies should try to implement this.
Yeah, well, I mean, the examples that you gave are companies that did take a long time to build a product, that took a lot of focus on a product.
Right.
But ultimately, like things like the iPhone were an example of this mentality, right? Apple held a pretty strong position with desktop computing and with the iPod. And by developing the iPhone, even though it took a long time, this was an example of saying, we're going to build a product that will bring us back to day one. And we'll release, and even if it cannibalizes the stuff that's brought us to this point, we're going to go ahead. So I think
so companies need to be willing to reinvent themselves from time to time, but the interval at which they do that might not be as frequently as I think you sort of suggested. Like Apple, the decision to do that, they were open to it and they were sort of looking for things that might reinvent. But when they decide, okay, this is going to be our focus for a while, Apple probably wasn't really taking on the idea of coming up with something else to replace the iPhone 3G, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I do think that these things can be a long process, but okay, for instance, I love this question. Okay, so for instance, if Apple said, we're gonna just sit on the Mac and sit on the iPod and we're good with that, then they would have been in trouble. But even though it was a long lead time, the fact that they did start to work on something new put them in position to be in the dominant position they're in. Microsoft, on the other hand, they said, we're going to sit on Microsoft, we're going to sit on Windows and milk that for all it's worth.
And that worked for a very long time for them.
It worked well for them, for sure.
And if they hadn't had that focus for a long time, they might not be in the position they are now. Whereas they are now in a position to be very successful and one of the biggest companies by market cap in the world.
Yeah. So I'm not saying ignore the flagship. I'm not saying reinvent rapidly. But like when Microsoft was able to see very clearly that there was a point where Windows wasn't going to work for it. It was able to reinvent itself. It actually took longer than it probably should have, and it's why they're trailing Amazon and cloud, and why they don't have anything going on in mobile. But yeah, I think companies should definitely take pride in their flagship product and make sure that it works well, because that's what got them to the game. But the key is, once these companies get a little too comfortable with it and don't see past it, that's when they start getting into trouble.
Hey, Alex, I think what's interesting about this question too is that it's like the nature of the product, right? Software inevitably is just easier to change or adjust or release new versions. And so in the case of the iPhone or SpaceX, the product has to be perfect, otherwise bad things happen, right?
Yeah.
Is that kind of maybe a delineation of like how fast a company can move in developing products? If it's something where it's like easy to adjust, kind of low impact if there are like outages, or maybe if it's like harder to adjust, like I work for a food company, so like we got to make sure that food's right,
Yeah. Well, so I guess I should be clear on it. Yeah, I don't think speed is a necessary component for the always day one mentality. But I do think these other things of like being able to anticipate what's coming around the corner by listening to employee ideas is super powerful. And one example of the hardware software thing. Apple's trying to build a self-driving car, and that is a hardware product. But it, like many products we're going to see come down the road, it's a hardware product that has a very important software component. And I don't think they've really done a good job applying the engineer's mindset there. And we'll talk about this in the Apple Week, but they've been so intent on letting design drive that process and not listening to ideas from around the organization, collaborating very poorly. They've let design make a number of decisions that have been pretty counterproductive. Here's one example that I love. Like with this, when you build a self-driving car, you typically put all these different types of sensors on top and on the side, and it looks like this kind of gross rolling submarine that is very unpleasant to look at. And design wanted to hide the sensors and did so without input from the engineering organization. And that ended up leading to poor quality data that the engineers then needed to use, because when you hide the sensor, you're starting to miss a lot of the data that sort of informs what you're seeing, because it limits the field of view. And the engineers struggled with the project because of that. So I do think that even, oftentimes we'll see hardware projects that will have, strong software components that, this sort of mentality applies.
We have one question from Wei Hung. How does Amazon structure the organization to incorporate the day one mentality by cannibalizing itself? Doesn't this create internal stigma between teams?
Yeah, it's very interesting. One of the most interesting things with Amazon employees is like they're kind of gung-ho about working themselves out of a job. We can talk about this next week, but there's like this idea inside Amazon called invent and simplify, where you invent something and then you simplify all the processes that are holding it up, and then you go and invent again. An example is in Amazon's retail organization, where they used to have people, or they still have people, much less, that would work with the vendors that they were working to supply in the fulfillment centers. So you would have one vendor say, okay, how many units of Tide are we going to stock in how many fulfillment centers at which price when? And Amazon eventually realized, okay, we don't need people doing this. We can end up putting this on autopilot, essentially, if we get our machine learning engineers figuring it out right. So they did that, and they automated a good chunk of it. And so the vendor manager was this really prestigious job inside Amazon. You had a lot of power. You got to speak with, all these interesting brands, and ultimately, like, you were the thing that kept the machine running inside that company. And then they put it on autopilot, and then all of a sudden they become not such a prestigious job. because now what they're doing instead of making these deals is they're auditing the deals that the software makes. Like the software was even negotiating with the vendors. So, so yeah, I think that there is, but I wouldn't call it stigma because it's so embraced inside the company that this is kind of viewed as something that's good. And in the book, like you'll hear from people who worked in the vendor manager function who say, you know, it wasn't pleasant, but I get it. Like the logic makes sense. And then what happens is they become part of the invention process for the next product. So there were people at Amazon who were automated out of some of these vendor management and retail responsibilities that went on and created some of the most interesting things at Amazon. So I think that once the employee base embraces it, you actually end up getting some great things out of it.
Great. All right. So we got Terry Kawaja from Luma Partners here with a question as well.
Hey, Terry, good to see you.
Hey, Alex, good to see you as well. Yeah, look, I haven't read the book, so that's my first opening disclosure. I will. I'm very much looking forward to it. And by the way, in keeping with this background of Don Draper's apartment, here's everybody. All right. You know, I've been obviously tracking Amazon for quite some time, and in many ways, I think this potentially could be one of the most consequential companies, not just in media or commerce, but for America, basically all time. And the question I have for you is, given that time you spent sort of with the people there, understanding the culture, understanding the mission, and getting a sense for what they're really all about, do you think if you were to look at your crystal ball going 10 years down the road, looking back, would you say that Amazon was a force for good in terms of the economy and the society? Those are two questions, or something else. In other words, the impossible question.
When I look 10 years in the future,
yeah.
If I
let's say 10 years in the future, looking back. So for the next 10 years, do we believe, given their hegemony, given their power, given how, as you know, people like Scott Galloway talk about their ability to eviscerate industries with an announcement because of their enormous power and building of their prime and distribution capabilities, will we look at them based on where you think the next decade plays out as a net positive or not?
I think well, it's a good question. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a net negative. But like, I think they have an opportunity to be a net positive. And here's why. You know, I think because they have this, they've become this platform. Yep. And they enable so many businesses. Like people say, what happened to the mom and pop shops? I think a lot of the mom and pop shops have transitioned to selling through Amazon. So instead of walking, I mean, this is the most extreme example, right? Instead of walking through the street and seeing, okay, here's a store I like, here's a store I like, you know, Amazon is the street now, right? Like they're the landlord. And the small businesses still exist. They just happen to be on the internet. And so the question is, how does the landlord act, right? I think it's in Amazon's interest to make the people selling on its platform strong. So the stronger those suppliers are, the better products they'll bring to the company, the better the customer experience will be, more people will want to use Amazon. And then honestly, that will help create a strong middle of our economy that will end up creating more people that will shop on Amazon. So they do have this opportunity to create, you know, a lot of wealth for people, not just their own employees, not just Jeff Bezos, but in the middle. I think when you see Jeff Bezos become as rich as he has, you can see what's happening with that wealth. It's starting to be concentrated at the top, but ultimately that might backfire on the company. So I think it's an amazing opportunity they have right now. Same thing with their workers, right? They're a massive employer right now. All these people who don't have jobs are able to go work in a fulfillment center. Might not be the best job, but it's work. Yeah. The question is, okay, Amazon, you're now like one of the most important employers in the world. How do you handle that responsibility? It's the same thing. The better that those people are treated, you know, the better the Amazon lives up to its customer obsession promise, and the better it's remembered as a company. On the other hand, if they become sick or if they become worked to the bone because Amazon doesn't care about workers, then it backfires on it. So it's this amazing moment in history, right, where they get to decide what type of company they are what type of society we're going to live in, because you're right, they are an important institution here.
Reminds me of that saying, with great power comes great responsibility. I agree with you that there's a lot of optionality in terms of how this may play out. And I'm not so concerned about the immediate sort of natural reactions of, let's say if the culture was anti-union or whatever at the outset, because all kinds of psyche goes into the time period when you're a startup and you're just trying to build a business. But over time, they have this ability to mature and maybe change their perspectives. Have you, in your analysis and time spent with the company, garnered any sense of their ability to be dynamically adjustable in terms of the way they think about how they perceive the world and their role in it?
Yeah, not really.
That was quick.
I have looked for evidence to show that Amazon will be a good steward of the power that it has, and I have not found enough. And I mean, yeah, like you look at, I mean, again, like the fact that Bezos is so wealthy is like case in point, right? He's taken all of that economic, surplus that he's created and sucked it up for himself largely. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I've seen Facebook capable of changing. Like they've definitely changed.
Wait a second. You're saying Facebook is good and Amazon, this is like up is down, down is up.
I'm just telling the truth based on
cats and dogs living together.
That's right. But here's what I'll say. Like, I just there's a reason why I wrote the book, right? Is because I do think that if these companies possess these systems which they've developed and honed for such a long time, and the rest of us viewed them as mysterious, unknowable, unbeatable, we'd be in trouble. But the more their systems get out there, the better off we're all going to be. And I'm generally uncomfortable with the amount of power that all these companies have. So, but like, yeah, it's, Facebook realized that it had this opportunity to be remembered as a force for good or evil, and started to make some adjustments. I don't think they're perfect yet, but they've certainly altered themselves. But with Amazon, like, okay, there was this example where they had a worker leading this protest about safety. I don't know if you saw it, but like there was this example where they basically had this internal email trying to talk about how the whistleblower was inarticulate, and they wanted to make this person the face of the protest because therefore the protest would look less credible. I mean, that's kind of evil, So Amazon just has yet to demonstrate that they have the empathy needed, to go along with their power.
Well, thank you, and Ian, for answering the question and for organizing this book club. This is awesome.
It'll work. It'll get smoother as we go.
Oh, this is great so far.
I know Hal's got a question that he wants to ask. So Hal, you're up.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Orchid. Hi, Alex.
Yeah. Versus in real life, the real life we have today.
Exactly right. So I just have two quick questions for you. So one is, going back to the marketing or sales CEO, most of these companies are engineering driven. Apple itself is design driven. And given that, obviously back to your earlier answer, a marketing or salesperson could be at the center of that engineer's mindset and be able to do all those things. Do you happen to have a feeling as to whether or not at any of these companies, power is going to shift from an engineering sort of a function to a marketing function, where that might make that more probable than it is now? So that's one question. The other question I had for you is, when it comes to the government and other places that might be able to use this automation technology to free people up more for idea work rather than execution work, what sort of risks do you see? One idea that I just think about with the government is, if you automate everything, it could just be turned off. You could literally turn off an entire agency with the next administration potentially. So I just love to hear your thoughts on those two questions.
Yeah. Okay. So I was initially going to instinctively say there won't be a marketing person that will lead these companies. But then I reminded that Adam Mosseri, who leads Instagram, is a design guy. So totally possible. I mean, yeah, so that's sort of proof that it can be mindset versus versus skill set, and it likely will. So yes, definitely, marketers and salespeople shouldn't give up on their opportunity to run a tech giant. I think that's definitely still in play. Okay, the government, I mean, it's great question. I don't think you run in blindly to start automating the whole government without, putting in some safeguards like the type that you mentioned. But that said, like, you can go into a government agency and you're going to have people doing, what's called the bullshit jobs, right? Jobs that people don't really need to do. And I think that finding a way to take those jobs and automate portions of them so that those people can be working on more important tasks is something the government should definitely think about. And we'll end up just with a much better government than the one that we have today. So maybe they can figure out testing if they're not, we're spending their whole day reconciling.
I think we've got Evan Stein here with a question as well. Evan. Do we have an Evan?
Sorry, I was double muted. Yeah, no, thanks, Alex, for doing this. Super cool and great to kind of catch up with you again. I just thought, based on your incredible access, what was kind of a cool story or anecdote or experience that you had that didn't make the book?
Oh, good question. Double muted. That's impressive. Okay. I mean, one of the things that we did a Black Mirror chapter towards the end of the book where I invited in a science fiction writer and someone who led the Arab Spring in Egypt, and basically said, like, let's go over, all these conversations, all this technology that these companies are using and see where it could go wrong. And so, like, we ended up making like 5 episodes of Black Mirror, like, sort of treatments with, like actual stories of people using this technology wrong. So we included 3 of those, and 2 of those got cut on the cutting room floor. I mean, so that's one example. I mean, the one interesting story, you don't really hear the backstory of like how a lot of these interviews are set up. So I'll just tell one story about Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple. So I cold emailed him because he had made some interesting comments about the iPhone. He just said that it had reached a form that's right, and that the iPhone 7 was the same as the iPhone 6, which is the same as the iPhone 5, and he wasn't upgrading. And I thought that was kind of interesting coming from the co-founder of Apple. And so, yeah, and this isn't in the book, but I emailed him and I'm like, hey, Steve, would love to meet with you and talk to you about this, just cold out of the blue. And he goes, what did he say? He said, yeah, no thanks, basically. And I was like, no, wait, we should talk about this. Here's a reason why we should have this conversation. And then he replied back and he said, okay, the next thing we should figure out is a time and the place. So I said, okay, so we decide to meet at this diner down by Cupertino. And I just show up there and I'm like, I like wrote an email to confirm. It was kind of spotty. And I was just like, all right, well, Woz isn't showing up. And next thing I know, he walks into the diner with his wife and business partner. And we sat down for like an hour-long conversation. No small talk at all before the interview happened. He just said, okay, what are we talking about? And bam, we just jump right into it. So it's fun. Like sometimes you have these little moments while you're reporting a book and you obviously have to keep the story on track, but every interview that you do has its own little story, in the background. That's always fun to tell in settings like these that you can't necessarily put into print.
Did Woz check in on Foursquare while we were there?
I remember him checking in on Foursquare. I think he checked in at the same diner previously, but not that time. I don't know. I
have an odd connection with his eating habits, given his public check-ins everywhere.
That's right. Yeah, Woz is the consumer user left in the whole world.
And we're a little over time, but I mean, there's still a great conversation, so I don't think we're going anywhere. So maybe we'll just do 2 last questions. Spencer, you've been waiting so patiently. First of all, hi. And Ian, if you could go ahead and unmute him, that'd be great.
He's great.
Awesome.
Thanks. And thanks, Orchid and everyone, for putting this together. It's pretty awesome. I was curious. Laszlo Bock, the former head of people at Google, wrote a great book called Work Rules. And he talks a lot about letting employees make mistakes, giving them kind of freedom in order to drive innovation. And a lot of companies do that really well and really let their employees out there. Others kind of pay lip service to it and don't necessarily, kind of wink, wink, but employees know that there's typically, maybe some penalties or other things for making mistakes. I'm just curious, in your interviews and in your experience with these companies, who's kind of doing that well? Are there any takeaways for the rest of us with that? And maybe who's not actually really doing it and paying lip service to it?
Yeah. Oh, and first of all, thanks for the question, Spencer. This is another good one for Evan, because I actually did speak with Laszlo and ended up cutting the interview out of the book. So, whoops. I do think the tech giants are like pretty good at giving people room to experiment and fail, for sure. Like, it happens at all these companies except for Apple. And I think that Apple is doesn't give Apple. It was amazing how many people were upset about working at Apple. I just never anticipated that was going to be the case. But people really don't enjoy working there precisely for that reason. You don't really have a lot of room to experiment and make mistakes. I mean, Facebook famously, you ship code like your first day that you're there, even if you're an intern. Google still has that experimentation quality to it, even though it's a little less than it used to be. Microsoft is like a real B2B, like enterprise software company, but they still focus, like allow people to do these type of things. I mean, we'll get to it, but they have a meeting. Satya Nadella has a meeting with his senior leadership team every week, and they have a researcher present to them. And it's called Researcher of the Amazing. And it's just one crazy idea that they came up with that, the senior leadership team wants to hear. And Amazon, I mean, Amazon is definitely more regimented in its decision-making process. Like, it doesn't just throw money at any projects. But the cool thing about Amazon is when people have ideas, they just write it down. That's the whole point, like, of the 6-pager that we'll talk about next week. But like, one of the amazing things about that company is, like, people really say that when you have something that you want to bring to leadership, you write it down and they'll take it seriously. So it's that ability to just say, okay, here's one example that I can give sort of close out this answer. One of my sources that I was speaking to about Amazon told me that he proposed Amazon create its own garbage and recycling service. Okay. And the reason why is because Amazon knows sort of who's collecting a lot of boxes, who is the biggest consumers, and could probably be like the best garbage / recycling pickup, do it better than the private services that do it, or the public do it better than the public services that do it. So we wrote it up and brought it to Amazon leadership and said, let's do our own, garbage and recycling service. And they talked to him about it. Like, they actually took a meeting on it. So I do think that this form of they obviously didn't approve it because it's a wacky idea, but the fact that like leadership will review these wacky ideas is sort of indicative of the fact that they want people coming up with these ideas internally and are willing to consider even the most out of left field and often green light stuff that, is likely to fail. That answer the question?
I think so. I think it has to. All right, so I think we've got time for one more question, and that goes to the question I just unmuted. And I love.
Did you unmute? No.
Sounds like someone's getting a bath.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. We'll pause there. But I'll actually read the question there, which is that given that that you're a reporter or a journalist, and it is fascinating that you've come at that from another career, but that's for another time. Do you think that the management experience that you've gotten from, or the management learning that you've gotten from a lot of these companies that you spoke to in the book, if any of those theses applies to newsrooms and reporters, and in essence, do you have any takeaways for that particular industry?
Yeah, well, here's the main takeaway is that reporters generally like to focus on bits and pieces of news. And I think that learning about like the systems underneath that news, what about the physiology of the companies produce the symptoms that we see, is fairly important. So that's just like the one reporting takeaway. Can newsrooms be reinventive? 100% they can. But I don't have all the answers because the media industry is kind of in a rough place. But Yeah, I mean, I can give an example. So, some of the folks here know that I went into Pittsburgh a couple of years ago, and I interviewed for a job sort of towards the top of the publication of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And I came in there, and they basically said, like, we're bleeding money. What do we do? And there are ideas that, if they just relied on advertising, they're going to be in trouble. But there are ideas that publications can try out that are creative and inventive that might help them get through this situation that they're in. So the example that I give is that when I was at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, they told me that, a lot of Pittsburgh has actually shrunk in population over the past bunch of years, unlike many cities. And the Pittsburgh diaspora lives all across the United States, which is why if you go into any city, you'll see people walking around with Steelers jerseys on a Sunday. It's not because that the Steelers are this nationally popular team. It's because literally people from Pittsburgh are just kind of living all across the country after leaving the city. So the idea I have for them, and this isn't the most brilliant idea in the world, but it's something they could have tried, is to create like a club where once a month they send, they can have people from Pittsburgh sign up, and they're not going to get the newspaper delivered to their door, but what if they paid like a monthly subscription fee and got a postcard with a picture that one of their photographers had taken from Pittsburgh and a note from home. Here's a few things that are happening in the city that you left. I think that might have potentially given them this opportunity to build, another revenue stream. And that was just one example. And you just throw some spaghetti at the wall. Next thing you know, you could be, running a bunch of different businesses and be more diversified. So you're not really at the mercy of the shocks of the advertising industry. So newsrooms can do it for sure.
All right, great. And I mean, we're a little over time and everybody hung in there, which is awesome. So thank you so much for joining our first gathering of this book club. So just a reminder, it is every Wednesday at this time, so 8 o'clock Eastern, 5 o'clock Pacific. Next week is going to be inside Jeff Bezos's culture of invention. And then the week after that, we're going to cover Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. So, feedback is a gift. So let's practice that. Feel free to share your feedback with myself and Ian. You can DM us on Twitter. We are extremely online, which is very sad, but we will see you there. And thank you so much, Alex. This was wonderful. Everybody, please, get your copy, make some notes, just remember the questions that you want to ask. But this was wonderful. So thank you so much for coming.
Buy at least one book.
I bought 2.
It was super cool. I have the goosebumps because this was sort of the thing that I was hoping for when I wrote the book, to be able to gather with people and talk about the lessons and hear what people think and go back and forth and see places where I might have been right and might have been wrong. So I definitely have some thinking to do before next week. And I appreciate you guys organizing it, Orchid and Ian. And thanks for everybody for attending. So I'm really stoked for next week as well.
Yeah. And cheers. I mean, Terry will embody Terry. I brought my beer. So, bring your beverage of choice, whether it's, mocktails, wine, whatever, it'll be a party. So thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Alex.